Historical Society for having me here again. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you to you all for coming, and happy first day of spring, and happy Women's History Month. So today I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then I'm happy to take any questions afterwards. And before I get into the talk, I just want to introduce my first friend here. This is Mary Mason. She's actually about 11 years old in this picture. It was painted about 1670 by an unknown artist. And she's the great-grandmother of Abigail Adams. I saw the portrait at the time. I was serving on the board of the Abigail Adams birthplace, and I became very intrigued and wrote an article about her. She has an interesting life, and she'll reappear a little bit later in the talk. So tonight I'm going to talk about the complex lives of colonial New England women. And I'll start by saying that all women in British North America lived under a system of patriarchy, which limited their lives and their roles and their actions because of their gender. Under the legal tradition of coverture, for example, when a woman married, she became known as a femme couverte, literally a covered woman. And her legal identity and very personhood were subsumed by those of her husband. But within these parameters, there existed room for a really wide range of experiences depending on a woman's race, ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic background, region where she lived, and time period in which she lived. Because we're looking at the colonial period, we start with 1620, when the people we know as the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth, and that extends for 150 years to the 1770s when the Revolution broke out. So historians have really only just begun to explore the range of these experiences seriously. It's only been really in the past few decades with the development of the women's movement in the 1960s and 70s, and the development of women's history, and also of social history, which emphasizes the fact that the experiences of all groups of people are worthy of study, not just white male leaders. So, the women I'm going to be talking about tonight they helped shape their society and lay the foundations for this nation in a variety of ways. And, excuse me. Let's start with the term founding fathers that we hear all the time. And let's take as our example Scituate. So this is a tribute to founding women, and I'm taking Anne Vinal. Anyone who's, and this talk isn't all about Scituate, but I just wanted to start with a Scituate example. So anyone who's vaguely familiar with the history of Scituate has probably heard the term men of Kent before. What about the women of Kent? So Scituate was founded and first settled, and of course there were native people living in the area for thousands of years previously, and I'm going to get to that story in a bit, but Scituate was founded in 1633, first settled in 1633, incorporated in 1636, but there was a group of merchant adventurer investors who were given, 4 of them, based in London, who were given a large tract of land in Scituate. It's called the Coughlin Grant. And Coughlin, although it sounds like Cohasset, it's actually referring to Scituate. It covers miles and miles and extends from the harbor to North Scituate and then a couple of miles inland. And of these 4 merchant adventurer investors, only one came to Scituate, and that was Timothy Hatherley. And he ended up buying out the other 3, and then he divided their shares into 27 lots. And he sold them to investors who became some of the founders of Scituate and wealthy landowners. And of these original landowners, who was one woman, Anne Vinal. She was a widow. We don't know much about her. There's some anecdotal evidence that she was supposedly a good businesswoman, because when she came over to the colonies, she brought sewing materials that she knew the women would buy because they were the main consumers of the family. Haven't been able to prove that. But in any case, I think the next time you hear the term men of Kent, I'd like you to think of Anne Vinal. And I'm going to start by talking about religion, just as a foundation, before I get into the everyday experiences of women at the time. Because religion really was a foundational aspect of many women's lives. Of course, many of the women who emigrated here in the first place came for religious reasons. And then just to broadly simplify, we know that the people who settled Plymouth Colony, people we call the Pilgrims, they were separatists. And again, this is a very broad definition, but they wanted to separate from the Church of England because they thought it had not gone far enough in removing itself from the ritual excesses in practices of the Catholic Church. Now, the Puritans who settled Massachusetts Bay, they weren't as radical as the separatists. They wanted to purify the church. But the two groups had many ideas in common. And of course, talking about Scituate, it's the northernmost town of Plymouth Colony and the second largest town. Both groups, the Puritans and the Pilgrims, really believed that individuals should have a direct relationship with God as mediated by Scripture. And this meant that they thought that reading the Bible was very important, and so literacy was stressed. And so early New England was a very literate society. We have two other groups here that were more radical than the Puritans and Pilgrims, the Baptists and the Quakers. All of these religions gave women access to some power in their lives. So the Puritan religion, it valued the religious experiences of women. It allowed them to become involved in the church. It, as I said, encouraged literacy. Now, the Baptists and the Quakers were lay-led movements that believed that you didn't necessarily need an educated clergyman to lead a congregation. So they would allow women to speak out. The Baptists allowed women to speak during meetings, and the Quakers allowed women to preach, and also gave them room in church government. They were both persecuted groups, and I'm not going to get into that story here, it's outside the purview of this talk. But Scituate has a really interesting relationship with the Quakers and with religion in general. So, starting with girlhood, colonial girlhood. And these are the siblings of Mary Mason, who I showed you the first slide. They were, again, painted about 1670 by an unknown artist. And when we talk about childhood during this period, we often have this idea that the children were the miniature adults. They weren't allowed time for play or for fun. And a lot of this idea stems from some lingering stereotypes we have about the Puritans being very repressive, serious, sour people. There's that, I'm going to paraphrase that quote, famous quote by H.L. Mencken, that Puritanism can be defined as being unhappy that someone somewhere is having a good time. It's not true. So the Puritans they enjoyed all of the good things in life. They enjoyed good food, good drink, leisure time, socializing. If you look at letters and diaries of the period, they're socializing all the time. But they believed that all of these things, all good things, should be enjoyed in moderation. They honored these things as gifts from God, but they thought to abuse them was to offend God. And this might not only just bring down God's displeasure on you, but on the whole community. Because they're trying to build these godly communities together. And so they took these offenses very seriously. So that said, children were allowed time for play, but education was also an important part of their upbringing. And typically, boys and girls would both start out very often by going to a dame school. A dame school had this name because they were taught by women in their homes, and the dame schools concentrated on teaching children how to read. After this, boys often went on for additional education to a grammar school where they would learn writing and different subjects. Girls, not so much. Writing at this time was looked upon as a specialized job-related skill. So not really necessary for girls to have. And those girls who were taught to write were often taught by their mother. And so at this time, in this time period too, if you see a document that's signed by an X, whether it's by a man or a woman, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were illiterate. It could just mean that they could read, but they just couldn't write. So women were early on instrumental in establishing an educational system in the country. And here are a couple of examples. Some evidence too is found in more informal areas like wills. So for example, on the left here is an example from the will of Samuel Fuller of Plymouth from 1633. And he specifies that he wants both his son and his daughter to go to school with Mrs. Hicks. Now, Samuel Fuller's wife, Bridget Fuller, was herself an educator, but she was very ill at the time and it wasn't known whether she would survive. So this is why Samuel Fuller makes this provision in his will. But the point is that he thinks that Mrs. Hicks is a good enough teacher for both his daughter and his son. And then this is on the right is a record from the early Weymouth Town records, 1699, and there are 5 women who agreed to teach school in the town. So again, just showing how women were so present in the early educational system. Now, along with teaching writing, mothers often taught their daughters, well, very commonly taught their daughters, the housewifery skills that they would need to keep a household running, but also more specialized knowledge, such as medical knowledge. So at this time, it was considered a wife's responsibility to oversee the health of her family, and there were very few trained medical practitioners, so often women oversaw the health of the community too. And these are a few examples of medical remedies from the diary of Hannibal Chandler Coit, who's the subject of my first book. She kept a diary 1688 to 1749, and she copied down these medical remedies, and this was rather common for women to write them down and pass the remedies down from mother to daughter. And then some women gained great renown as healers. A couple of examples, Joanna Roster of Cotton. She was the wife of Reverend John Cotton Jr. of Plymouth, and she was widely respected as a healer. And I just have an example from a letter her husband wrote in 1698. Just on one day, she was called to 5 different households, seeing to people's children and spouses, and she was just a very busy healer. And then I have an example of Elizabeth Greenleaf, who was married to a minister in Yarmouth who was having trouble with his ministry, and so she, to help the family out, took their 12 children up to Boston and opened an apothecary shop. And she's considered America's first female pharmacist. And then I have a little bit from a book, New England Rarities Discovered, by John Jocelyn, who was a British traveler and physician. And he took note of different medical remedies he came across in his travels that were provided either by women or indigenous people or African and African American people, which leads me to my next subject, which is Native women. So we think about when the colonists arrived here, they're used to using, and women are used to using different herbs and plants in the landscape for healing, and they come here and a lot of these plants and herbs are different. So obviously they need insight into what is going to help. And one example is the cranberry, the iconic cranberry. But the Native people which shared that it was useful for healing a variety of ills. And also talking about Native women, they were the ones who shared the information, that, again, iconic information about the 3 sisters, the corn, beans, and squash being used to support each other so that all of the plants would grow. Native women were the primary agricultural workers in their culture. And unlike in British culture and colonial culture, the Native women were the inheritors of land because of this. So land passed from mother to daughter instead of from father to son, as it did in colonial culture. And so again, through the generosity of Native people who shared this knowledge, it really helped enable the colonists to survive. And then speaking about African and African American women, So slavery of Native people started in the 1600s as a result of wars with the Indians, but also slavery of Africans started too. And their presence is very well documented in New England. So just thinking about how did African and African American women survive, how did they protect their cultural beliefs, and just a couple of examples. The cowrie shell is actually from Monticello, but a similar one was found in an archaeological excavation at the Winslow House in Marshfield. And cowrie shells were used by African people for currency, jewelry, religious artifacts. So it's amazing that this shell survived coming over from Africa. And then a picture of berries to exemplify that an archaeological excavation that was done at the Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford turned up a number of berry seeds in the slave quarters, and the article discusses how women and girls were the primary ones who went on the berry picking expeditions. And just thinking about this in some imagination in a broader context, there are this is an occasion where women and girls are by themselves. They have a chance to talk, they have a chance to pass on spiritual beliefs and cultural lore and traditions. So very important, just a very important factor in their culture survival. So all, or most, not all, but many colonial women married. It was expected that they would marry. And kind of, again, addressing lingering stereotypes that we have about courtship and marriage from this period. Some people think that women got married very, very young and marriages were arranged, and neither is the case. Women were typically about 20 years old when they married, and men were a couple of years older because they had to be old enough to support a family. And marriages weren't arranged. Parental approval was seen as important, but there are other factors that were seen as important too. One was a similar socioeconomic background, another is a similar religion, and another is romantic attraction. And so you see this again in letters between betrothed people and married people. This is a very affectionate extract from a letter that Reverend John Norton of Hingham wrote to Mary Mason, the woman from the first picture. When Mary was older, she's living in Boston, and John is, as I said, a minister in Hingham, and he said, paraphrase, my body is well here in Hingham, but as far as for my heart, I must have required an account of it from you, because I left it with you in Boston. So, very sweet. But courtship was different then. People got betrothed first, and this was taken very seriously. And in fact, if you broke a betrothal, you could be sued for breach of promise. But also there was an old tradition brought over from England that many people, once they were betrothed, they perceived themselves as just about as good as being married. And so this kind of explains some of the higher premarital sex statistics from this period higher than you might think. It's not that people were, necessarily misbehaving, but it's just tradition that they figured that they were almost as good as married. And as far as that goes too, the Puritans did not approve of sex outside marriage, but there was, for couples generally married after being that involved with each other. But it is interesting looking at ministers' writings from this period too. They're encouraging closeness between a husband and a wife, spiritual closeness, but also physical closeness. So this is a slide that I showed in my last presentation of Penelope Pelham and Josiah Winslow. Penelope Pelham with Winslow is the subject of my second book, but I'm showing this again because it's a marriage portrait. These portraits were done prior to their marriage around 1651. Josiah was the son of Pilgrim Edward Winslow, and he himself would become the first native-born governor of Plymouth. And Penelope was a member of the English gentry. Her third great-grandmother was Mary Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's sister. So this was regarded as a good match as far as social status. These people were in the same elite status. And to that end, also just pointing out with Josiah, he's, you might take a quick look at him and think, he's wearing black, he looks like a Puritan to me, but he's wearing black because black was the most expensive dye to make, and it was a very fashionable color at the time, so he's consciously wearing black to display his wealth. Same with his white starched collar and his gold tassel. And Penelope too, the way she is dressed, with these lustrous fabrics, the point is to demonstrate her wealth in the portrait. And so social status at this time was so important that a high-ranking woman could potentially wield more influence than a propertyless man. So I'm not saying she could participate in the political process, but she could definitely have a lot of influence. And it was only in later centuries that really a woman's gender became the defining concept of her life, and not just one of the concepts. So motherhood would quite often follow marriage, and the families in Plymouth Colony were generally large and healthy, or successful, I'll say. The first generation, I believe, had an average of 7 children, the second generation an average of 8 children, and the third generation an average of 9 children. So, and women would start to have children when they got married, so they're starting in their early 20s, and they would typically have children every 2 years, so they could still be having children when their own children were starting families of their own. Now, we know childhood mortality was an issue at this time. I believe the statistic is 1 out of 10 children died, and in a city or a congested area where illness could spread that much more quickly, it could be as high as 3 in 10. And also, this is a period where there's a lot going on in a household, so there's a lot of childhood accidents. And Minnie Chandler Hoyt, the diarist I showed you earlier, she even has a page in her diary where she just records all of the accidents that her children were involved in. So it could be a fraught period. Childhood could be a very fraught period. But also, there's maternal mortality too. Many women died during childbirth or afterward from infection, and I think the statistic there is about, it's up to debate because the records are not wonderful for that period as far as maternal mortality. But I'm showing this picture, I'm showing the men of Kent Cemetery, but I wanted to just give a shout out to this little sermon, this elegy, this tribute by Reverend William Witherell, Scituate, to Sarah Christian. She died in 1679, she was in her late 30s. In the way he talks about her, the piously affected matron, but she's the mother of 12 living children and 1 dead child, sadly. So clearly she had passed away in childbirth, or right after, and the child passed away too. But I think it's nice that he wrote this tribute to her, and it's a published poem, I believe. He wrote another one that I came across, Elizabeth Stetson in Scituate, and so he seems to have been a very favorable view of women in his parish, or his congregation. So with the growth of the Plymouth Colony and New England families, of course, this is impinging on native lands and is putting pressure on native families. But the families that were under the most duress, of course, are the enslaved families. So I have here an ad from a 1721 Boston newspaper. It's really a heartbreaking ad. It's talking about the sale of a 23-year-old woman and her 4-year-old and her 7-year-old, and it specifies they can be sold together or separately. So, this is just, again, one of the most pernicious effects of slavery, breaking up families like this, and it's just really unimaginable. And then I have this quote from the will of Walter Briggs from 1676. And he is leaving his enslaved girl, Maria, to his wife. And I had used this, I've given this presentation before, and I had used this, and I hadn't really, when I talked about it, it's just another example of splitting up slave families because where are Mariah's parents? But then just recently, I looked at some notes that I had from a journalist and researcher named Patty Hayner, who years ago started compiling information on enslaved people in Scituate in Norway. And a lot of people are doing it now, but she started, I think, in the 90s, if not earlier. So she did real yeoman's work, amazing work on this. And so I was looking at the documents and information she had compiled. And so just to try and give a summary of this poor Mariah's life, she was actually sold, it's unclear where she was born, Boston or Barbados, but she was originally sold to Walter Briggs in 1673, this is 3 years beforehand. Then Walter Briggs dies, and she is inherited by Walter Briggs' wife, but then she dies, and then Walter Briggs' son dies, who would have been the next heir. And so Mariah is inherited by Walter Briggs' daughter-in-law. And then about 10 years later, and she has, I think it's about 1687, following year Mariah has a child. And then the following year, Mariah and her son are sold by the daughter-in-law to a man, Cornelius Briggs, in Barnstable. Cornelius Briggs comes back to Scituate, makes his will in 1693, and in his will, he specifies that Mariah can have her freedom in 13 years, so 1706, but he makes no provision for her son. And so Mariah is inherited by his heirs, who sell her to another owner in Scituate, her and her son. This owner does respect that she is to be freed in 1706. However, the son is not freed, and he's sold to someone in Hingham. So Mariah is freed in 1706. A couple of years later, she has a daughter, and then a couple of years later, another daughter, and then she gets married in 1714. And just horribly, Cornelius Briggs' son takes her daughter into slavery. And it's illegal because Mariah is free. The condition of the child follows the condition of the mother. But Mariah is free when she gives birth to her daughter, her older daughter Mary, but Cornelius takes Mary he enslaves her. And so Mariah and her husband, Anthony, end up filing suit against Cornelius in 1717. And they win, but he appeals it. And then Mariah dies the next year before he has a chance to go back to court. So it's 1718. She's lived 12 years in freedom, but those years have been fraught because of her 3 children, 2 that are enslaved, and I forgot to mention her husband is enslaved too. So eventually it is resolved that her daughter is freed in 1720. But this is a long aside, but I think it's worth delving into just to see how fraught and horrifying the situations of these people, that they have to live in could be. So, among a woman's duties, in addition to running a household, etc., was to be a, quote, deputy husband. And at this time, this is well before the Industrial Revolution, so men aren't needing to go to offices. For the most part, they're conducting their work from home. And it's expected that because it's taking place from the home, the wife is going to be aware of the husband's business dealings. She can keep accounts for him, perhaps, or deal with creditors or customers when they come to the house if he's not there. But also, if a husband predeceases the wife might take over his business. And this is the case with a couple of printers here. So we have Elizabeth Glover. She and her husband brought the first printing press to British North America. They brought it to Cambridge. And he died soon afterwards, and so Elizabeth Glover was the first printer. She printed the first book in America, the Baby Song book, in 1640. And then we also have the example of Anne Franklin. Anne Franklin is Benjamin Franklin's sister-in-law. Her husband died in 1735, and she was operating the first press in Rhode Island. This is a petition that she wrote in 1736, asking the General Assembly, which is the legislative body, if she could have permission, have a contract to print the laws and acts. And then later she becomes the first female newspaper publisher in America. A couple of other examples, mill owners. So we have the recreation of, a latter-day recreation of the Jenny Grist Mill from Plymouth. Sarah Jenny's husband dies in 1644, and she takes over the mill. And then closer to home here, we have the Stockbridge Mill. So Charles Stockbridge died in 1684, and he didn't leave a will, but the court appointed his wife, Abigail, to run the sawmill and gristmill until their two youngest sons, who were under the age of 10, came of age. One way in which a wife might work with her husband was as a tavern keeper. So it was very common for couples to run taverns. And so just thinking about this in a broader perspective too is really interesting, because colonial America, people were on the move. They were traveling all the time, whether to pick up business or visit friends or family. It's really astonishing how much travel was accomplished. And you just think of travelers coming into the tavern and sharing news, and there's so much going on in the colonial period too. So all of these rapidly changing circumstances, news of this is being brought into the tavern, and so this is just one way to which a woman's world might be widened by having access to this news and these updates. This is the 1713, it's a house museum now, Cabin and White Handy House in Westport. I did a consulting project for them, researching one of the first female owners. But then I just want to point out too that a woman's participation in tavern running was seen as so vital that I found an example from Taunton, where an innkeeper, James Leonard, after his wife died, the town revoked his tavern license because they thought he wouldn't be capable of running a public house. So we've seen how women have been active in business, but just even on a more granular level, how they were involved with the economy. If you look at wills of wealthy widows, you'll often see evidence that they were lending money to both men and women. This is an example from the 1631 will of Mary Ring of Plymouth, and she's lending money to the governor. And she talks about money from commodities coming from England, so she's involved in the transatlantic trade. And then also beaver, so she's involved in the fur trade that is underpinning early Plymouth's economy. And then I have a picture of wampum. Now, Native peoples didn't use wampum as currency, but the colonies were short on currency in the early years, and the Dutch had the idea of using, the Dutch in New York had the idea of using currency, using wampum as currency. And so early on, Native women were making wampum. So, you can kind of think of them, they were making wampum for the colonists. You can kind of think of them as like early mint makers in a way. And then, obviously, perniciously, we have to think about African women and African American women. Their labor is underpinning the economy, their commodities themselves, and then also as the trade with the West Indies expands in the later 1600s, it really explodes. And this really begins to tie the New England economy very closely to that slave-based economy, because the sugar production in the West Indies is so lucrative that they're not making anything else for themselves. They're not producing anything else for themselves. They're importing everything. And so New England merchants are shipping lots of things to support the plantation economy. So widowhood. So when a man predeceased his wife, he would generally leave her what is called the dower, her dower thirds. And this was a third of his personal property. It's really their personal property, but the law considered it his. And a third life interest in his real estate. And so it's interesting sometimes to compare a man's will and inventory to the widow's will and inventory and see how the widow may have expanded on the estate. So this is a really remarkable individual. This is Anne Pollard of Boston, painted in 1721 when she's 100. And she lives 4 more years, dying in 1725 at 104. She's supposedly the last surviving member of the 1630 Winthrop fleet that settled Massachusetts Bay Colony. And she leaves this will. And she specifies how she expanded on her husband's estate. And she talks about, she has considerably advanced the estate. And through her own disbursements, She's acquired more real estate to the amount of 200 pounds or more, which is a lot of money, and she paid for out of my own proper getting by my labor and industry. So she is really trying to emphasize the ways that she has contributed to growing this estate for their children. And again, wills of married women didn't leave wills because their property would go to their husband automatically, although they could certainly make gifts to people. But looking at a widow's will, it's one of the few public ways, it's one of the few ways that a woman might make her private wishes public. So, commemoration. So this is a great obituary of Elizabeth Gilman of New Hampshire, who died at the age of 80, and this is from 1719. And just looking at the different points made in this obituary really gives you an idea of, really reflects some of the values of society at this time. So it said she had so many children, and this is looked at to have a lot of children was looked as a blessing, that she could raise 2 military companies, and she is she's a gentlewoman, so she is someone of elite birth. She's of rare accomplishment, so she's educated. She is well skilled in surgery, so she has medical knowledge, and she shares it with the poor. And she's also of a meek, humble, and pleasant temper, so that's a good thing. But crowned by all is that she is a sincere lover of true religion. So, this is just a great example of summing up of what society at that time valued about religion. And then in conclusion, I just want to say that we often go to a historic house museum or a historic site, and we'll see a reenactor in period clothing engaged in an activity like this, churning butter, spinning, cooking, etc. One public historian notably said that when you have this experience as a visitor, you often leave knowing more about how to make candles or soap than you do about an actual woman of the time period, and which I agree with. And I would just encourage you, the next time you go to a historic site, that you think about the individual women who lived at that site and what their particular perspective may have been, given the context in which they lived, their personal background. And I think not only will having a deeper understanding of this enrich your experience with that place and your knowledge of history, but just of the complex and fascinating nature of the American past. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yes. You talked about the women passing on information to their female daughters and younger girls. Were they limited with the amount of time that they could spend together as a group?
No, because they're together all the time, right? Because were you talking about the enslaved women?
No.
Oh, just the women that go to your house, right?
Picking and all of that thing.
Yes.
I was just wondering, did they have a lot of time together? They did.
So are you talking about the enslaved women or just women in
Women in general.
Women in general, yes, they would have a lot of time together because the home is the base, so they would have a lot of time together. And I wouldn't say, we kind of think about women of the time period being really tied to the home, and that's not necessarily true, because they are so engaged in their community in various ways. They're socializing, they're sharing health care, they're involved in the religious community. The home is the base, and so yes, the most important thing would be to pass on these just daily living skills to their daughters, and then the more specialized knowledge too, so they would have a lot of time together. Any other questions? All right, I'm happy to chat with anyone else too.
I was just wondering, so for these women that had, 7, 8, 9 children, and yet they also have to do all of the cooking and the sewing and what support did they have?
So they did actually have, communities of women working together too. They would help each other out with different projects, and they would often have, some wealthy women would have servants. There were a lot of servants around, or enslaved people. But then there also would be, girls in the neighborhood helping out families, other families. So there is a big enough. I mean, I'm not undermining, and I said this slide right here about the work. I don't mean to undermine the amount of work that women did, but there's these other layers to their lives. But yeah, there was help, and also, a woman would not be, we have the myth to it like a self-sufficient household, and that's impossible. So people were trading things all the time, and they're trading goods and they're trading services. So I'm not saying that they weren't busy all the time, but there was a pooling of work and sharing of skills, etc.
I think there was someone over on this side.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I just wanted to know if you're working on another book right now.
I am. So my current book project has to do with, I mentioned about the social status of being more important than gender as far as defining a woman's life. So I'm looking at other women, I got intrigued by that when researching Penelope Winslow. So other women of the most elite status in the colonies, so the governor's wives of the 13 colonies that made up the original 13 United States, I call them the first ladies. But then also comparing their experiences to, as I said, female native tribal leaders. They were where the governor's wives had softer power. The female native tribal leaders were acknowledged leaders of their tribes. And then also there was a tradition in the north of free and enslaved black people electing a governor to kind of just settle, to be a community leader. And so looking at their wives and also women of African birth, and that was also often women of African royal birth, became governors' wives in their communities. They tried to preserve, again, like their heritage and their royal lineage. So it is fascinating just to compare those three very broadly different experiences.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.